Thank you again. So it's the privilege of my life for 35 years to have walked with gang members, and the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God. To the thousands of men and women who have walked through our doors there at Homeboy, people like Luis Perez, who for about 10 years worked for us, and then he moved away with his family and got another job that paid better, which every job pays better, you know. But he was a gang member, shot caller, drug addict, heroin addict in recovery, and he was like a force of nature. But he was also a good speaker. You know, he kind of inhabited his story and told it and shared it, and was much in demand even by high schools. They'd ask for him by name. And one night, he and I, just the two of us, went out to dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. And he said, you know, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. That is good advice there. So that's just my way of saying brace yourselves. What I think we're about, you know, here this day and in our lives is to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. What we're called to do as we leave this place eventually today is to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And as Pope Francis invites us, you know, is to inch our way out to the margins, because the only way the margins get erased is if we stand out at them. And we do this in our own way, in our own particularity, and we stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. We stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And my suspicion is everyone in this room has had the palpable experience of being able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You know what it's like to have stand with the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And so what you imagine is a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And I suspect if kinship happened to be our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice. We would be celebrating it. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. No matter how singularly focused we may well be on those worthy goals, the truth of the matter is they can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other, unless we all together stand against forgetting that we belong. For an idea has taken root in the world, it's at the root of all that's wrong with it, and the idea would be this: that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. We stand against that. And so we go to the margins, and indeed we brace ourselves, because the world will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And you go to the margins and other voices suddenly get heard. None of that makes a lick of sense, I don't think, unless we're anchored in a notion of God that's spacious and expansive. I suppose if there are two spiritualities that undergird what we do at Homeboy, one is Ignatian spirituality, since I'm a Jesuit, and the other one is, Doshi mentioned the great Jean Vanier. So to the extent that you can extract from the whole L'Arche community movement, which started 60 years ago, and he just died. And Becoming Human is a good text to kind of capture that. There's a lot there, though he writes quite simply. But those are the two kind of spiritualities that undergird what we do. But I think the thing that you come to is that there is nothing more consequential in our lives than the notion of God we have, because we're kind of doomed. If God is tiny and puny and exacting and judgmental and a jerk, you have no choice, except that's how you're going to be. If your God is unconditionally loving and wildly spacious and expansive, then that's how you're going to be. So the trick in the world, it seems to me, is to know what kind of God we actually have, and then notice that we've settled for a partial God, a puny God, a tiny God. And you don't want to settle, because all puny gods are projections of ourselves, the God that we've created in our own image. My friend Annie Lamott always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. And I think that's, again, quite right. I had a spiritual director many years ago who said, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit. But of course he's right, because we've settled for a partial one. Meister Eckhart, a theologian and mystic who, died 500 years ago or something, he used to say, it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And I think we have a hard time believing that. Teresa of Avila or some other mystic says, our notion of God is a jar that you should be breaking, that you need to break. And the idea is to make room for a larger God. I think that's a constant thing. Otherwise, without knowing it, we will be stuck in the third grade notion of the God who we beg to help us pass the math test. I know I didn't study for it, but please help me pass it anyway. And I think we'd be shocked how much we've settled for a partial, lesser God. Nobody has kind of broadened my, vision in terms of this than the homies, and they do it every day. All of a sudden you enter into this huge spaciousness of the God we have and the heart God has, and how we hope to align our hearts there. A lot of times they'll do it by way of mangling the English language, in ways that are charming and disarming and illuminating. Like I had a homie who, a home girl, Lisa, who was one of our trainees, a gang member, been to prison. And we're 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And so it was the end of the day, and her man had come to pick her up, so she wanted to introduce him to me. And she said, "This is my sufficient other." And I said, "No doubt." What allows me to be in San Antonio today is, I have a CEO named Tom who kind of runs the place, and what a relief, because our program is like a $20 million annual operation, and it's nice to have somebody else worried about meeting payroll and budgets and stuff. So I was in my office, and a homie came in, one of our trainees, and he said, "Damn, Gene, my lady, she is in a bad mood." And I said, "Why?" "Well, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I just finished mine, so I kind of know what she's going through." But my favorite one happened when I was presiding at Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall. We have 3 of them in Los Angeles, huge. And I was in a gym with 500 gang members, mainly. And they're all seated in folding chairs. And I'm up on a kind of a raised platform, and I'm vested in my alb and stole. And And they have these sheets that have the readings in English and Spanish. And so you know how when you preside, you close it sometimes. I'm going to close my eyes and listen to the word proclaimed. So the first guy got up and he did the first reading. The second guy got up and did the responsorial psalm. And as my eyes are closed, I was listening. I said, the guy has kind of a overabundance of confidence, in his voice. And he says, the Lord is exhausted. And I looked at the sheet, what the hell? And it was the Lord is exalted. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because if we're honest, the exalted God, truthfully, is our projection onto God. That's God created in our own image. If we were God, we would want to be exalted. But the exhausted God, now that's more spacious. That's generous. It's humble. Oh gosh, it's not about me. It's about you. Wow, that's a way better God than the one we have. That's the God we actually have. Last year, I buried my 92-year-old mama, who I had buried my father 25 years ago. And she had 8 kids, and I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers. And she died as anyone would hope to die, in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by the people she loves. And she was sharp to the day she died. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't one lick afraid of dying. In fact, a couple weeks before she died, she said to me, and she was just positively giddy. I've never done this before. It was like something you might say just before skydiving, In fact, the day before she died, when it happened to be her last words to me, she was asleep and I was alone in the room with her, and she woke up and saw me there and she said, oh, for crying out loud, and went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off she was still alive. Sorry. And the next day at exactly noon, again, this never happened that I was there, the only person there. Usually there was a hubbub of people. A couple of my sisters went out to get lunch, and I was the only one there, and she was asleep. And she woke up, eyes wide open, and she let out this tiny, glorious, wondrous gasp. Skydiving. And no one in earshot of this sound could ever be afraid of death again. But in her last weeks of her life, there'd be 2 of us, 3 of us, 8 of us around her bed, and she'd be in and out of consciousness or sleep. And when she would come to, she would lock onto one of us, and with breathless delight, she'd say, oh, you're here. You're here. And when I buried her, I thought, this may well be the singular agenda of the God we actually have. Nobody believes this, but I think in your heart of hearts, your own experiential sense of who God is, this is true. Behold the one beholding you and smiling. That's true. You notice the notice of God, and then you want to be the notice of God in the world. You receive the tender glance, and then you choose to be that tender glance in the world. And it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. Part of the thing, of course, is we're so ingrained, especially in our 3rd grade, where we all get stuck, that God wants something from us. But I think the God we actually have only wants for us. Or as Jesus says succinctly, my joy yours, your joy complete. That's it. I suspect that Jesus, even in 40 days and 40 nights, which was the precursor to our Lent, that, we have this whole projection onto it. Dark night of the soul and agony and grumbling stomach and why did I come out here and why did I give up chocolate and scotch for Lent, whatever was going on in his mind. But I suspect what it really was God looking at him and saying, you're here. You're here. And Jesus, what's the response to that except to say, you're here? And it's this model of exquisite mutuality where there is no daylight that separates us from God. And then the hope is that how we will be in the world. But it's hard for us to believe this notion. I said this once to a huge group of people at the Chautauqua Institute. And it was a series of lectures. And he was a pastor, older gentleman, retired. And he said, I loved all your talks, except I disagreed with the one thing. I said, well, what was that? And he said, where you say God doesn't want anything from us, only for us. And then he said, what about the 10 Commandments? And of course, there's only one thing you can say to a question like that is, what about them? As parents, you don't want stuff from your kid. You just don't. You only want for your kid. I don't think that's so hard to see. I remember once I was given a talk in an evening at a school, a shishi fufu kind of private school, and it wasn't to the kids, it was all to the parents and some faculty, and I did it as a favor to a friend, and it was a packed room like this, and in the front row was this kid, Diego, 10 years old. I found out later what his name was, and he was there sitting next to his mother. And I was telling stories, and I watched this kid, he laughing at all the right parts, and whenever I told a story that might require some slack-jawed response, he was slack-jawed. And then I got to the end, and I told that story that I told you earlier about Puppet and Youngster. And I traveled through that story, and I watched him. And the adults were like this, discreetly flicking tears. Not Diego. He just lost it, 10 years old. And he's just sobbing. He's just weeping. And his mom looks at him with incredible love. And she wasn't trying to silence him, but she just very gently put her arm, and when it touched down on his shoulder, he turned to her and said, "What?" And it was a showstopper. I stopped speaking. Everybody in the room looks at this little Diego. And then you think he's going to demur a little bit, but he doesn't. He turns to her and he says, "What?" And you know exactly what the question means. What do you want from me? How have I embarrassed you here? How am I not measuring up to what you want me to be? And you may say, oh, she was just trying to silence him. No, if you saw the look on her face, she tried to communicate two things. One, how in the world did I get so lucky to have a kid like you? One, clear. Second thing, what breaks your heart breaks my heart. That was it. Why is that so hard for us to believe about the God we have? How did I get so lucky to have you as my kid? What breaks your heart breaks mine, period. I don't want anything from you. I only want for you. And then we kind of go, oh, but there are things in the world that we need to fix. Of course. But the starting place is the same. We need to reclaim the mysticism of Jesus. There's the starting place. Jesus didn't believe in God. He knew God face to face like Moses. That's where you begin. And once you begin there, it's not God has given me a list of things I got to do. No. Once you inhabit this tender glance, all you can do, you're compelled to be that tender glance in the world. And so everybody starts where everybody starts, which is service, and whatever motivates you to do that. And that's a good place, it's a logical place as you go out to the margins. But service is the hallway that wants to get you to the ballroom. And the ballroom is the place of exquisite mutuality, just like Jesus and God. It's the place of connection. It's the place of kinship. So don't get stuck in service. That's not the point. We do not go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. Because if you go to the margins to make a difference, how is that not about you? It's only about you. I don't care what you do. I don't care how good your service is. If you go to the margins to make a difference, it's only about you. I was at Houston giving a talk, and afterwards a former gang member and been to prison. Now he's working in the streets, as we call hardcore gang intervention workers. Very good guy and very sincere and earnest, and he pleads with me after the talk, and he says, how do you reach them? Meaning gang members. And I found myself saying to him, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? And all of a sudden you turn something on its head when you conceive of service that way. It's not passive. 100 years ago, like 80, whenever it was, 81, I was studying theology, and I was privileged to be able to take a course at Harvard Divinity, team taught by Henry Nouwen and Parker Palmer. You know, I was like, who are these guys anyway, you know? And the course was called Ministry. And I can remember this was just before Henry Nouwen kind of got a little disaffected. That ended him in the L'Arche communities where he ended up dying, but changed his life to go there. But he was kind of had it. He only was there for one semester at Harvard. And a woman said, what is ministry anyway? And he was kind of frustrated. He says, can you receive people? That's what he said. I'll never forget it. Because that's it. That's the same thing. Can you be reached by people? Can you receive who people are? It feels passive, but it's the opposite of passive. It's how people inhabit their own goodness and truth. My mom was an opera singer, and we found this record she had recorded called I can't remember what it's called, but it's the Christmas Carol. Long lay the world in sin and error. What's Oh Holy Night? And we played the grooves. It was only one song, and we didn't know that this glorious voice belonged to the woman who hollered at us. We had no idea she was an opera singer. And long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. Yeah, it's a song about Jesus, and yeah, it's a song about Christmas, but how is it not the job description of everyone in this room? You appear, and the soul feels its worth. And that happens in the same way that God calls us to our true self in loving. Tender glance, tender glance. You appear, and you're not transforming lives. You're receiving. You're allowing yourself to be reached. And the soul feels its worth. Suddenly, everybody is inhabiting their goodness and their gifts. Everybody's inhabiting their truth. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and he was just the best listener of any human being I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to Cesar, nobody else existed. It was just you, laser beam focused. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if somebody more important was on the approach. It was as if he was saying to you, you're here. You're here. He embodied the tender glance. So famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual." And that's what we hope for. Otherwise, in service, we stay distant. Service provider, service recipient. I will give you what you need. I will fix you. I will repair you. I will rescue you. I will save you. A reporter from PBS finished an interview with me by saying, "How's it feel to have saved so many thousands and thousands of lives?" And I don't mean to be coy or cute. I said, "I don't know what you're talking about. The only thing I know for sure is my life has been saved here. And besides, I think saving lives is for the Coast Guard." And the choice is to save the world, which is about you, or to savor the world, which is about receiving people, about humbly entering into relationship with people, and which was sort of the strategy of Jesus. There were kind of two tracks. Jesus embraced the humble path. The humble person looks at the poor or the folk on the margin and asks a question: what would help you? The person anchored in hubris, and Jesus sort of bumps heads with them, doesn't ask a question, they make a statement. Here's what your problem is. It's why Jesus says, I think, that it's really hard for rich people to get into heaven. It has nothing to do with bank accounts. It has to do with being anchored in hubris. And they can't enter into the exquisite mutuality that's being offered at the margins because they are the smartest people in the world, in the room, and nobody else has worked harder or whatever it is. And it's hard for powerful, influential, successful people to kind of say, yeah, the largest slice of this pie that accounts for my success is just sheer dumb luck. And so I have every reason to be humble. And that's why Jesus says, it's hard for rich people. It's easier for a camel to do needlepoint. How does that go? You know what I mean. And so we want to bridge that distance, and we want to be anchored in humility, and that's how you do it, I think. But you want to make sure that even the distance in service, that there is no daylight separating us, not service provider, service recipient. So I remember no homie found more job opportunities through Homeboy Industries than a guy we all called Dreamer. I knew him since he was a little mocosito growing up in the projects, and his older brothers were from this one gang, and he joined the gang too. It still was a part of what I talked about earlier today, a lethal absence of hope. No kid is seeking anything. They're all fleeing something, and he was no different. Very smart kid, though I don't recall he ever went to school very much. But he was had a dangerous sense of humor, which I always loved. And but he's in his 40s now and doing well. He's has a home, a good job, in recovery, kids. But in his early 20s, he was a yo-yo. He was in and out of being locked up, back and forth, back and forth. And I would find him a job in the private sector or in one of our 9 social enterprises, but he would always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So it was a very frustrating, repetitious pattern. So this one time he finished a 4-month stretch of probation violation in county jail, and here he is sitting in front of my desk. And he says what gang members often say, this time it'll be different. I went, oh, all right. So with him sitting there, I picked up the phone. I called a friend of mine named Gary, who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And Gary had hired homies in the past, so I thought, well, hoping against hope, maybe he could do it again. And that guy said to me, you tell that guy to come here tomorrow morning. He starts tomorrow. That's a holy man there. And so Dreamer began work the next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk. I couldn't believe my eyeballs. I said, "Híjole, Madre Santa." Here we go all over again. But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out an envelope. It's his very first paycheck, and he waves it proudly. And he says, "Damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, who?" And he looked at me strangely and he said, "Well, God, of course." "Oh, sure, no, that's right. That would be God. You thought I was going to say you." I said, "No, gosh. God's number one." And he looked at me and he said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." "I'm sorry, them Genesis days?" He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now." Well, the thing I most remember was the two of us, we just fell out of our chairs, literally, howling with laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider, who's the service recipient. It's mutual. So in the covenantal relationship, the original one, you have God saying to God's people, "As I have loved you." Now we can finish this sentence with the exalted God, the one created in our own image. "Love me back." But that's not what our God says. "As I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger." And God has identified these three subgroupings, if you will, of the poor, because God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these happen to be our trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. Now you've turned this whole thing on its head. You don't go to the margins to make a difference, to rescue, save those on the margins. You go there because that's where our trustworthy guides are, who will lead us to the kinship of God. I'm going to mangle this quote from Ron, but it's about, if I recall it correctly, but it's about the widow, orphan, and stranger. How that sounds to modern ears, it's kind of, what? We like widows. What's the big deal? Orphans melt our heart. Strangers, maybe in our polarized tribal moment, that may be a different thing. But you have this thing where you say that the people who originally heard it looked at that widow, orphan, stranger and said, "We can live without you." That's a powerful statement, because when I reflect on that at Homeboy, we want to be able to say, "We can't live without you," as well as saying, "We won't live without you," which is now a different stance. And however you want to say widow, orphan, and stranger, immigrant, homeless. When I started at Dolores Mission, there was this caste system, and the lowest rung, not even on the ladder, didn't have a rung, was the most demonized group, which was the gang member. And how we all kind of got to this place where we ceased to demonize, because demonizing is always untruth, and it's always the opposite of God, and that's something you can take to the bank. Because when it's happening, you go, "Oh, okay, that's untruth. Oh, all right, that's the opposite of God," and there are no exceptions to this notion, which is why there is nothing more consequential than breaking the jar of our own personal notion of God so that more room is made. all of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. Now at Homeboy, we're just allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking gang members to measure up. And the reason is simple, because our exhausted God doesn't do it. Why would we do it? Instead, we hold the mirror up and you return people to themselves, which is sort of key. Because at Homeboy, we never say, we hope you change, or one day you might become a better person. No, you're exactly what God had in mind when God made you. Unshakable goodness. Everybody, as the Dalai Lama says, everybody has Buddha nature. Everybody. No exceptions. Now, we recognize that in terms of our own health, there's stuff that keeps us from seeing that truth. But the notion that somehow we got thrown out of the garden and somehow we got to work our way back in, and by becoming a better person, do good and avoid evil, it's nonsense. It's here. And we need to help each other see. That's why you hold the mirror up. That's why at the margins, everybody is returned to their own dignity and unshakable goodness. Everybody is returned to their nobility. Save the world or savor it. To savor each other. To delight in each other. And that's key. This is fresh in my mind, so it's new material because it just happened last week. And so there's a guy named Chino who I've known for 20 years and worked for us in and out for about 5. Thoroughly good human being, but he can't see it because of undergirding mental health issues that he masks by getting high. Now he's drinking all the time. And he needs to go to rehab, but just refuses, and his mom just died, so he's just a mess. So he texts me the other day, and he says, "Hey, G, kick me down with some feria," which means money. And I said, "Son, you're my son. I love you like a rock. I will always help you, but I will only help you. So if I give you money, I'm not helping you. Let's get you into rehab. You need rehab, I'll pay for it. Come in and see me. We need to get you into rehab." And then I add this. I know you've burned all your bridges with your family and your friends. You will never burn this bridge with me. I push send. He writes me right back, "Fuck your bridge." and I was startled by it. And I thought, well, I'm going to savor this, you know. And there's that kind of thing where there's the momentary sting, and I've known this kid forever, and you want to win the argument, you know, F me, F you. No, you just savor it. And I remember I told my counsel's made up of all the homies, and we talk about the homies who work there, and that it's become our shorthand. Before I flew here, one of the homies, Jose, came up to me and he hugged me and he whispered in my ear, "Fuck your bridge." I said, "Hey, you too, dog, thanks." I mention that because it's a total mess. I mean, you know, he's finally agreed to go to rehab, by the way. But it's messy. You know, it's not. Mother Teresa says we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. And you want to stay faithful to a strategy and approach. You want to somehow embody the God who loves us without measure and without regret. And it's messy. And everything's about something else. It's about pain, it's about trauma. You know, they say damaged people damage people. But it's equally true that cherished people will know how to cherish. will feel compelled to cherish. That's a powerful tool. We get stuck because we think it's about content. Oh yeah, here's my 10-point plan, you know. Nah, it's not about content. It's about context. You know, if love is the answer, well, community is the context, and tenderness is the methodology. Because if your love is not tender, it stays in the air, it's in the ether, it's in your head, it's even in your heart. But unless it becomes tender, it's not connective tissue. And unless you can kind of embrace and savor all the mess of stuff, like Chino sending you a foul text, you're going to just want to just work with the most likely to succeed, and you'll never make it out to the margins. And that's where the joy is. Love your enemies is not the harder thing, and that's why we're invited to do the harder thing, because the harder thing is just the harder thing. But Jesus is suggesting this is one of the things that resembles the God we have. And there's a homie who writes me every morning, email, Sergio, and he loves Ron's writing. He's read every book. And he writes me every morning. In fact, I just texted him, told him that I met you. He was thrilled. A gang member, been to prison, tattooed, in recovery. But he has this notion, which is quite brilliant, it seems to me, that we're invited by Jesus to do him one better, which is great. So he has this thing where he says, Jesus says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I say, love your enemies. And then Sergio says, I refuse to have enemies. Jesus is pleased by that progression because now you're in a whole other place. I refuse to have enemies. I mean, recently I read this, I was kind of alarmed by it, in Sojourner's magazine, by a woman who said, we need to reclaim the discipline of loving your enemies. In order to do that, you have to have enemies. You have to know who your enemies are. It felt young to me. And she identified the acting director of ICE. He said his name. He's my enemy. Well, I get policies that you need to oppose. I'm not going to have any enemies because I agree with Sergio that you have heard it said. But Sergio says, don't have enemies. Because demonizing is always untruth, and it is always the opposite of the God we have. And so all of us are invited to be enlightened witnesses. People who, through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. But we know, at Homeboy we know, that you have to reach in and dismantle messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Marcus Borg, the great scripture scholar, says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout scripture is shame and disgrace, and I think that's quite right. Every homie who walks through our doors comes barricaded behind a wall of shame. And it's our experience there that only tenderness can scale that wall. That's what's sort of utterly unique about it. In the Acts of the Apostles, it has this one odd line, and it says simply, and awe came upon everyone. And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So some years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. It's what they call in the biz a gang in-service. So it's 9 to 5, a hotel ballroom, keynotes, breakout sessions, workshops. Social workers come and they get credits. I've done a couple of those, and so I figured, maybe I'll do a keynote or something, and I said yes. I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, you know how you do this? You pull out the original letter. What is this thing again? And to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker, 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself, oh, hell no. So I called in 2 homies, trainees, Andre and Jose, and I sat them down. And of our 18-month program, they were like at the 9th month or something. I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, as I recall, and he's like 25 years old at the time, tattooed, gang member, been to prison. At that particular juncture, we have these phases where you do a lot of things, and you work here and you work there. He had become a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only did he have a stretch in prison, he had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers did what you just did. They audibly gasped. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And then the audience did what you just did. So we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I'd never seen that before. And then he continued his story. I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California. And she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. And second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. We're invited to go from this place today to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And there are only 4 things: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. They're big things, but they're only 4. We want to live as though the truth were true, and we want to put first things recognizably first. I was interviewed once on the Christian Broadcasting Network by this very nice Christian lady, and she asked me about, what do you do at Homeboy Industries? And I told her all what we do, as I mentioned in the earlier talk: tattoo removal, job training, a community of tenderness that welcomes people, cherishes people, therapy, case management, navigation, 9 social enterprise. I went on and on for some length, and when I took a breath and I stopped, she kind of made a face. And she said, yeah, but how much time each day do you spend, at Homeboy Industries? Praising God. And I didn't know what to say. So I said, all damn day. And honestly, I don't think she liked that answer very much. But it begs this question, and I'm going to end with this. What kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? So it occurs to universities mainly sometimes to force their students to read my books against their will. I'm not complaining, but my alma mater in Spokane, Gonzaga University, forced the incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart, and they said, we're going to have a big venue, 1,000 people, could you come and speak? And I said, sure. Oh, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I always do if people are going to pay for it, and if the trip's not too complicated. And I always pick homies in the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals from rival gangs among our trainees, just to force them to share a hotel room just to mess with them. And then I always pick homies who have never flown just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky, Some years ago, I had 2 older vatos who we were flying from LAX to DC, and one of them, dead serious, said, hey, gee, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yeah, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies, Bobby, an African-American gang member who at the time worked in the bakery, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store. I've done this 1,000 times easily, men and women. I always bring 2, and I've never had anybody who I picked more terrified to the bone, panicked beyond belief than this guy, Mario. It was starting to freak me out a little bit. In fact, he was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even, boarded the plane yet. So we're at Burbank Airport, which is kind of a smallish airport, Southwest Airlines, big planes, but you don't board with the hermetically sealed chute. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps that go to the front of the plane, and the big feature at Burbank are the steps that go to the back of the plane. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and Bobby's off walking somewhere in the airport. Our plane arrives. It's early morning. They deplane. I turned to Mario and I said, that's our plane. And I think, wow, he may die before we actually climb those stairs. So then I see our flight crew, and it's pilots, and there are 2 flight attendants, females, and they have each 2 big, large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps, and Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said this, but I should tell you that in our 31-year history as an organization, Mario is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which is really saying something. He's all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody, I guess. So I'm trying to calm him down. I'm walking him in the airport. I've never been in public with him, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting. Because if you were to go to Homeboy on Monday, walk up to anybody who works there and say, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? They won't say me. They'll think for half a second and say, Mario. Yeah, Mario. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. He's proof of what Jean Vanier says, that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. So we get to Gonzaga, and there's the big talk at night. What they don't tell you is they have 93 other talks, which they neglected to tell you about. You know, it's like this class, this meeting, this lunch, this, all damn day. And so I tell these two guys, I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. You get up, tell your stories. Mario in particular was quite undone by the prospect of this, but they both did a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So the nighttime talk came in 1,000 people, standing room only, and I coaxed the two of them to get up and do much what they had done earlier, like a 7-minute snapshot of their lives, so that I can include them in the question and answer. And they did a good job, though Mario, again, was quite terrified. And I get up, do my thing. Then I invite them to stand on either side of me, and yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario is this tall, skinny drink of water, and he clutches the microphone. Yes. And he's just terrified. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? You know, what advice do you give them? And Mario clutches the microphone. I can sense he's starting to tremble, and he's closing his eyes, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say. And when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know that he's losing the battle with his tears, but he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And let there be no doubt that everybody standing had been returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. And so we go to the margins to create a community of kinship because we have received the tender glance, and we know that God wants us to be one. and the soul feels its worth, and everybody inhabits their unshakable goodness all over again, and everybody stands in their own nobility, and the margins get erased when you stand out there. And soon enough, everyone will cease to care if anyone accuses us of wasting our time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you all very much.